I want to share something with you. Not a lesson from a book, not a theory I read somewhere, but a story that came to me one ordinary evening and shook the foundations of what I thought I believed. I used to think I had life figured out. I thought strength meant control. I thought wisdom meant always having the answers. I thought faith was something you either had or you didn't. And then, this story arrived. Simple, innocent, not rehearsed, but raw, pure, true. It wasn't dressed up with big words. It didn't come with rules or arguments. It simply held up a mirror and forced me to look. In that story, I saw courage where I once saw weakness. I saw hope where I had settled for doubt. I saw love stripped of conditions, powerful enough to tear through the walls I had built inside myself. And I realized, belief isn't about what you say in public. It isn't about the mask you wear. It's about the quiet truth you live when no one is watching. That day, I understood that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truths. That sometimes the story that looks fragile is the one strong enough to break chains. And that belief, true belief, doesn't demand proof, it demands surrender. Since that moment, I've never looked at life the same way again. Because I know, one story can change a mind, one story can break a pattern, one story can ignite a new belief. And the story I heard that day did exactly that. I used to walk through life with a kind of certainty that felt unshakable. I believed that if I had the answers, if I carried myself with confidence, and if I stood firm in what I thought I knew, then nothing could move me. That certainty was like armor, a shield I wore every single day. I told myself that strength was about control, about holding the line, about refusing to bend even when life tried to push me. And in that certainty, I felt safe. But safety can be a dangerous thing, because it convinces you that you've arrived, that you've figured it all out, and that nothing new can surprise you. But then life does what it always does. It interrupts. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care about your carefully constructed walls. And it doesn't care about the stories you tell yourself. Life comes with something unexpected, something small, something ordinary on the surface, but extraordinary in its effect. That was the day certainty began to shake, not because of some loud crisis or a thunderstorm of chaos, but because of a story, a simple story, a story that walked straight past my armor and touched something deeper inside me, something that I didn't even realize was still there. In that moment, I discovered that certainty is fragile. It looks strong from the outside, but it is built on the need to be right. And the need to be right is the very thing that makes us blind to greater truths. When the story unfolded before me, I couldn't argue with it. I couldn't defend myself against it. I couldn't pretend that it didn't reach me. It wasn't about facts or logic. It was about something raw, something undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt my beliefs shake. Not because they were weak, but because they had never been tested in that way before. It is an unsettling thing when the ground you stand on begins to tremble. Everything you thought was unmovable suddenly feels uncertain. The ideas you leaned on for stability start to look thin, and the words you've used to define yourself no longer feel as solid as they once did. But that shaking, as uncomfortable as it is, has a strange beauty to it, because it shows you that you are still alive, still growing, still capable of being moved. If your certainty cannot be touched, then it isn't strength, it's stubbornness. But if your certainty can be shaken, it means there's room for something greater to step in. That was the gift of that story. It didn't destroy me, but it made me aware that my foundation needed to be rebuilt, not on control, not on arrogance, not on the illusion of having all the answers, but on something real. The shaking wasn't the end, it was the beginning, and in that tremble, I realized that certainty is not the highest form of strength. The highest form of strength is the willingness to let go of certainty and let truth, in whatever form it comes, reshape you. There is something disarming about simplicity. We live in a world where complexity is often celebrated, where the loudest voices and the most decorated arguments seem to win attention. We are conditioned to believe that truth must be wrapped in layers of explanation, that wisdom has to come from authority, or that deep lessons require heavy words. But then, out of nowhere, something small arrives, a line, a phrase, a story stripped bare of decoration, and it pierces deeper than the longest lecture ever could. That is the power of simplicity. When the story reached me, it wasn't dressed in sophistication. It didn't come with philosophy or rhetoric. It was plain, almost childlike in its delivery. But that's exactly why it mattered. Because truth doesn't need to be dressed up to be powerful. It doesn't need to be explained 10 different ways to leave an impact. When something is simple, it goes straight to the heart before the mind has time to complicate it. It bypasses the defenses we build, the filters we wear. And it touches the raw part of us that recognizes truth instantly, even if we've spent years denying it. We underestimate simplicity because we mistake it for weakness. We think that if something is profound, it has to be complicated. But life itself proves otherwise. A sunrise is simple. A heartbeat is simple. A tear is simple. None of these need explanation. Yet all of them carry power beyond measure. In the same way, the story that came to me didn't arrive with fanfare. It was a whisper, yet it carried the weight of thunder. What makes simplicity so powerful is that it leaves no room for excuses. When words are plain and stripped down, they confront you directly. You can't hide behind interpretation. You can't distract yourself with overthinking. You either face it or you run from it. And in that moment, I couldn't run. The story revealed itself in such a raw and uncomplicated way that it forced me to stand still. I didn't have time to argue with it. I didn't have time to analyze it. I only had time to feel it. That feeling lingered long after the story was spoken. I realized that the truths that last the longest are rarely the ones hidden in heavy speeches. They are the truths carried in small, clear moments. The ones you don't forget because they were never cluttered to begin with. And that's what shook me most. The understanding that all my chasing of complicated answers had blinded me to the fact that the most transformative wisdom often wears the cloak of simplicity. When life speaks simply, it speaks universally. It doesn't matter how much education you have, how much success you've gathered, or how much you think you know. Simplicity cuts through every barrier. It reaches both the learned and the unlearned, the strong and the weak, the old and the young. That is why it has power. That is why it changes beliefs. Because the deepest truths don't need to be explained. They only need to be spoken. And when they are, they echo inside you with a clarity that cannot be ignored. For most of my life, I thought strength meant control. I thought it was about holding everything together, never letting the cracks show, never allowing anyone to see the battles raging inside. I wore strength like a mask, rigid, untouchable, unbreakable. I convinced myself that to bend was to fail, and to show weakness was to invite defeat. That was the definition of strength I carried, and it shaped the way I lived, the way I spoke, the way I saw myself. But the story that reached me exposed the lie hidden in that belief. It revealed something that I had overlooked for years, that real strength is not about control. It is about courage in vulnerability. The moment I heard it, I felt something inside me soften, though I didn't want it to. My old self wanted to resist, to argue, to dismiss the idea. But there was no denying the truth I saw. Strength was not in the polished armor, but in the raw openness that dared to exist without it. It was not in the tight grip I kept on life, but in the willingness to let go and face reality as it is, even when it hurts. That realization shook me, because it was the opposite of how I had lived. Vulnerability had always seemed like weakness to me. I thought it meant being fragile, being breakable, being less. But in that story, I saw that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the ultimate test of courage. It takes courage to admit you don't have all the answers. It takes courage to open your heart, knowing it might get hurt. It takes courage to stand in front of the world as you are, without the shield of perfection. And the irony is that while I thought my control made me strong, it was actually fear disguised as power. I was afraid of being seen, afraid of being judged, afraid of being broken. But courage does not hide behind fear, it walks through it. Vulnerability is that walk. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. The people who have moved me most in life were never the ones who looked flawless. They were the ones who allowed their struggles to be seen, who spoke their truth even when their voices shook, who let their scars show because those scars carried stories. That is strength. Not the kind that dominates or intimidates, but the kind that inspires and liberates. The kind that says, I may be broken, but I am not afraid to be real. The story reminded me that strength is not measured by how tightly we hold on, but by how bravely we can let go. It is not measured by the size of the walls we build, but by the willingness to tear them down and stand exposed. It is not measured by how unshakable we appear, but by how deeply we allow ourselves to feel, even when it hurts. And in that feeling, in that raw, unguarded place, there lies a strength so rare and so powerful that it can change not just a person, but everyone who witnesses it. For a long time, I thought belief was about words. I thought it was about what you said in public, about how well you could argue your case, about how loudly you could declare your faith in something. I believed that if I could explain it, if I could defend it, if I could prove it, then it was real. That was the picture of belief I carried. But when the story came to me, it broke that picture into pieces. It showed me that belief has nothing to do with noise and everything to do with quiet truth. Real belief is not spoken loudly, it is lived quietly. The story was simple, but it carried a weight that words alone could never hold. It didn't come with a demand for proof, and it didn't need an argument to justify itself. It just was. And in its quietness, it revealed something I had missed all along, that the loudest declarations can be empty, but the smallest consistent actions reveal the deepest convictions. What you live when no one is watching says far more about what you believe than what you shout when the world is listening. I started to realize that belief isn't about putting on a mask of certainty. It's not about convincing others, or even convincing yourself. It's about embodying a truth so deeply that you don't need to announce it, because it radiates in the way you move, in the way you treat others, in the way you respond when life doesn't go as planned. That kind of belief doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need agreement. It stands quietly, like a flame in the dark, unshaken by the winds around it. The story reminded me that some of the most powerful lives ever lived were not defined by speeches, but by actions. People remember not just what was said, but what was done. Words fade, but the quiet consistency of someone's life lingers long after. True belief doesn't beg for attention. It creates impact without asking for it. It is felt, not performed. And here's the paradox. The world trains us to believe that louder is stronger, that visibility equals influence. But in reality, the quiet belief that refuses to be shaken often changes more lives than the loudest performance ever could. The person who stands firm in silence is often more powerful than the one who fills the air with arguments. Because belief is not about noise, it is about alignment. Alignment between what you say and what you do, between what you claim and how you live. The story made me ask myself, what do I live when the world is not looking? Do I only believe when it's convenient? Or is my belief woven into the way I breathe, the way I carry myself, the way I handle the storms? That's when I understood. The quiet truth of lived belief is louder than any spoken declaration. It doesn't need to be announced, because it is undeniable. It's easy to assume that the most powerful messages come from the biggest platforms, the loudest voices, the people we label as experts or authorities. We are conditioned to believe that wisdom must come from someone older, someone more experienced, someone who carries titles or wears the weight of knowledge. But the story that reached me broke that illusion. It reminded me that sometimes the smallest voices, the ones you would never expect, carry the deepest truths. And when those voices speak, they cut through layers of noise in a way no authority ever could. The impact of a small voice lies in its purity. It doesn't try to impress. It doesn't aim to dominate. It simply expresses what it knows without agenda, without manipulation. And in that simplicity, it carries a raw kind of honesty. The story I heard didn't come from a place of power. It wasn't delivered with confidence polished by years of practice. It was vulnerable, it was unguarded, and because of that, it was unforgettable. It showed me that transformation doesn't always arrive in grand speeches. It often arrives in whispers. There is something humbling about being moved by a voice you didn't expect to matter. It forces you to re-examine the way you measure influence. It makes you realize that truth is not confined to authority. It can rise from anywhere, through anyone, at any time. And sometimes the ones we overlook are the very ones carrying the answers we've been searching for. That is why small voices matter. They catch us off guard. They bypass our expectations and reach the parts of us that the practiced voices fail to touch. The more I reflected on it, the clearer it became. We often silence ourselves because we think our voice isn't big enough, strong enough, or important enough. But if a small voice could change me so deeply, then every voice has the potential to ignite change. The size of the platform doesn't determine the power of the message. What matters is the truth it carries, and the courage it takes to speak it. Sometimes a single sentence from the least expected person can tear down walls built by years of doubt. The story reminded me that we need to listen differently. We need to stop waiting for wisdom to come from grand stages and start recognizing it in the quiet moments, in the overlooked spaces, in the voices that seem small at first but hold a weight far greater than their volume. Because when truth comes through a small voice, it echoes, not because it shouts, but because it speaks directly to the soul. And when that happens, you cannot ignore it, no matter how hard you try. That is the beauty of small voices. They prove that influence is not about size, but about sincerity. They show us that the deepest truths often come from the most unexpected places. And they remind us that if we are willing to listen, even the quietest story can shake the strongest belief. Stories have a way of slipping past the walls we build around ourselves. We spend years constructing defenses, convincing ourselves that we are strong, that we are unshakable, that we see clearly. But when a story is spoken, it doesn't attack those walls head on. Instead, it moves silently, weaving its way into the heart, and before we realize it, we are face to face with a reflection of ourselves. That is the mirror effect. Stories reveal what we often refuse to acknowledge. The hidden truths we bury, the fears we mask, the longings we silence. And when that mirror is held up, it can be both painful and liberating at the same time. The story that reached me did exactly that. It wasn't told to challenge me directly, but as I listened, I saw pieces of myself inside it. I saw the parts I had ignored, the doubts I had pushed aside, the cracks I had tried to cover. And in that moment, the story became more than just words. It became a reflection. It forced me to confront things I had been running from, things I didn't want to name but could no longer deny. That is the strange power of a story. You think you are simply hearing someone else's experience, but suddenly it is your own life staring back at you. We don't like mirrors when they show us something uncomfortable. It's easier to dismiss the story, to say it doesn't apply, to turn away before the reflection cuts too deep. But if we have the courage to keep looking, we find something invaluable. We find clarity. We discover truths that had been hiding in the noise of our daily lives. We uncover patterns we never admitted to, fears we never spoke of, and desires we tried to bury. And in that exposure, even though it stings, we are given the chance to grow. Because you cannot change what you refuse to see, and a story makes you see. What struck me most is how subtle the process is. A story doesn't demand that you change. It simply shows you who you are. And that glimpse can be more powerful than any command or lecture. It's not someone telling you what to do. It's you recognizing yourself in the mirror and realizing that something within you has to shift. That kind of realization cannot be forced. It must be discovered. That is why the mirror effect is so powerful. It doesn't push, it reveals. The story I heard reminded me that sometimes the answers we seek are already within us, but we are too afraid to face them. We look outward for guidance, for validation, for direction, but the mirror of a story points us inward. It makes us acknowledge the truth we've hidden from ourselves. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is the moment when belief begins to change, not because someone convinced you, but because you finally recognized yourself in the reflection and knew it was time to evolve. One story can carry the power to undo years of conditioning. It doesn't take a library of explanations, it doesn't take hours of debate, and it doesn't take endless repetition. Sometimes, all it takes is a single story told at the right time, in the right way, to shift something so deeply within us that our entire perspective changes. That is the mystery of transformation. It rarely happens in gradual, predictable steps. More often, it arrives like lightning, striking through the fog of everything we thought we knew, leaving us unable to see life the same way again. The story I encountered wasn't complicated. It wasn't wrapped in eloquence or sophistication. But it carried a spark, and that spark ignited something inside me. For years, I had lived with a certain belief, holding it like a compass, trusting it to guide me. And yet, in the space of a few moments, one story was enough to reveal that the compass had been pointing me in circles. That's the force of a single story. It doesn't just inform, it reorients, it redirects your steps. It forces you to question the foundation you stand on, and in that questioning, it opens the door to something new. We often underestimate how much influence one story can have because we imagine change as something monumental. We think it requires an overwhelming experience, a grand event, or a lifetime of effort. But the truth is, change often begins with a seed. A story is that seed. Once planted, it grows silently, pushing against the soil of our old beliefs until it breaks through. Sometimes the story moves us immediately, and sometimes it lingers quietly in the background, resurfacing in moments when we least expect it. Either way, its impact cannot be contained. What makes a story so powerful is its ability to bypass resistance. Logic can be argued with, facts can be denied. But a story slips past defenses because it speaks to the heart. It resonates with something primal in us, the part that longs to connect, to understand, to find meaning. And once that connection is made, it cannot be undone. Even if you try to ignore it, the story remains. It echoes in your mind, reminding you that there is another way to see, another way to live, another way to believe. The story that changed me reminded me that belief is never as fixed as we think. One narrative, one voice, one perspective can flip the lens through which we view everything. That's why a single story can hold infinite change. It has the ability to dismantle fear, to inspire courage, to heal wounds, to ignite faith. And what begins as just a moment of listening can ripple outward into every area of life, rewriting not just what you believe, but who you are becoming. That is the undeniable power of one story. It may seem small, but within it lies the force to reshape an entire lifetime. When I look back on that moment, I realize it wasn't just a story I heard. It was a doorway that invited me to step beyond the limits of what I thought I knew, beyond the walls I had built around myself, beyond the certainty I had mistaken for truth. That one story shattered my belief in the way only truth can, quietly, powerfully, irreversibly. And here is what I carry with me now. It doesn't take a lifetime of answers to change a life. It takes one spark, one voice, one story that dares to be honest enough to reach you where nothing else has. I stand here not as someone who figured it all out, but as someone who was reminded that transformation often begins in the simplest of ways. So if there is anything I leave with you tonight, it is this: never underestimate the story you hear and the story you carry, because one story can break chains, one story can breathe life into dead places, one story can rewrite the way you see yourself in the world. I know this because it happened to me. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to you. Goodbye and thank you notes. Thank you for giving me your ears, your hearts, and your time. Thank you for walking with me through this moment, for letting these words find a home inside you. I don't take it lightly. Every listener is a gift. Every shared breath a reminder that stories connect us all. May the story I shared ripple into your life in ways unseen. May it challenge you, move you, and perhaps even change you. And until we meet again, carry your story with courage, because the world is waiting to be moved by it. Thank you. Goodbye.